Welcome to Acceleres Presents. Today we're going to cover getting data and value from Service Manager with the OLAP cubes. Our presenters today are Nick Titillo and Pete Quagliarello. If at any time during the session you have an issue with technical issue, please, I am Scott Jones, who's our technical moderator today. So let's get right into it. I'll turn it right over to Nick and Pete. Good morning.
Hey, Dave.
Hey guys, this is Nick. So we'll get right in.
Yeah, what we're going to cover today, we're going to move through this pretty briskly. This is a fairly big topic, and we're really just going to give you the broad brush here. But we want to talk about first, generally, different ways to get data from Service Manager, since there are a number, and then we're going to drill down and focus specifically on the new reporting infrastructure in Service Manager, the OLAP cubes. Nick is going to give us an overview of the OLAP cubes, tell us a bit about what they are, how they work, and then we're going to look at what we can do with an OLAP cube, and then finally wrap up by just talking a little more generally about how to make sure that you're getting the right data in and out of Service Manager. So with that, Nick, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, so like Pete said, we're going to start by looking at all of the various different ways you can get data out of Service Manager, because there's quite a few different ways beyond just sort of the standard reports that ship the Service Manager. The first method that we're going to just look at briefly here of getting data out is views. These are the views that you can see within the console, and these connect right into the Service Manager CMDB. The advantage of these is that they're easy to access, you can personalize them, you can build all of the different kinds of views that you might need, and primarily here the data is real time. So it's plugging into the CMDB, it's up to the minute data. And you get the added benefit that you can actually copy and paste data right out of views into like an Excel spreadsheet. So it's not a bad way of doing some ad hoc reporting. That being said, they aren't really intended for reporting. They're really intended to give analysts access to the work items and configuration items that they're going to be working with in the console. So they're not optimized for reporting, but they are definitely an option when it comes to getting data out of Service Manager. The next here is the built-in reports, and if you've seen Service Manager at all, you might be familiar with the reports that come out of the box. There's maybe about 2 or 3 dozen of them, and they cover all of the work items and configuration items. These are easy to access. They're hosted in SQL Server reporting services. You can tailor access, so the folks that need to get access to them can, and the others don't. The issue with these reports really is just that they're difficult, or in some cases impossible, to customize. And because of that, what you get, what you see on the report is really all that you get. If you need additional columns or additional filters, it's not really possible to do that with the built-in reports. The next option we have here is PowerShell. This isn't something that we typically use from a reporting point of view. We use this a lot for getting data exports from Service Manager. Obviously, there's a lot of administrative tasks that you can perform with PowerShell, but it is possible to get real-time data from the CMDB using PowerShell in a table format and then export that to an Excel file. Most frequently, we'll do that to get data exports from the system. If we need to back data up before we're going to delete it, for instance, in a production environment prior to go live, we may get all of the data out, delete it, and then but we'll take it back above it in case we need to get any of it back. Obviously the issue with PowerShell there just being a skill set thing. Not everyone is real comfortable with writing PowerShell scripts, and it's not, again, really intended for reporting purposes, but it is an option. The next 2 columns here, SQL queries and custom SSRS reports, are really sort of one and the same thing. Those SSRS reports are based on SQL queries. These are going to plug into the data mart, and we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between the CMDB and the data mart in the next slide. Obviously, SQL queries and the custom SSRS reports, we're getting into the real reporting capability in Service Manager here. It's powerful, it's flexible, you can get access to all of the data you need to and all of the filters you need to. The cons here really just being that it requires SQL capability. You have to be able to write SQL queries or build SSRS reports, and that requires a special skill set. And it's also not the kind of thing that's going to allow you to do ad hoc reporting. because you will have to go through the process of writing and testing your query and then converting that into an SSRS report. It's not the kind of thing that you would typically do in 5 or 10 minutes before a meeting. And then the last thing here, which is really the focus of this presentation, is the OLAP cubes. And these OLAP cubes have their own data source, which again we'll talk about in the next couple of slides. These are just as powerful and flexible as the SQL-based reports. The primary difference here is that we can access these reports via Excel in a pivot table or with a pivot chart. So what this really does is it's going to give us access to just about the same information as the SSRS reports or the SQL queries do, but you don't need a special skill set beyond experience with Excel to build your reports. So here we are really talking about being able to build ad hoc reports in a few minutes, and obviously because you don't need SQL experience, it gets you to the data you need a lot faster, a lot more easily, and it'll open up building reports to a wider audience. So with that, I just want to look in a couple minutes about how data moves through the system. When we're talking about these different data sources, we just want to make sure everyone understands what we mean. So in Service Manager, there's a series of databases that the data flows through. You can see at the bottom of this slide, the orange database there, Service Manager. That is the CMDB, and that's your live database. So the console is going to plug into this database, PowerShell does, and this is really where your analysts are working from. Then there's a series of ETL jobs, extract, transform, and load jobs, that the data warehouse component of Service Manager runs this data through. And that's going to move this data from the Service Manager database into a series of data warehouse databases until ultimately they land in the DW Datamart database, which is where all the reports extract their data from. And finally, there's going to be a series of cube processing jobs, which are run by SQL Server Analysis Services, which are going to take data out of that Datamart and publish that into various different cubes. There's 6 of them, I think, available to you out of the box in Service Manager, and you can build your own, and we'll talk a little bit about that later as well. So we've got a bunch of different data sources here, and you can see the frequencies for these jobs. So the key thing I wanted to cover on this slide here really is just that the Service Manager database, the CMDB, is up to the minute data. It's live data. The data warehouse Datamart, where all of the SSRS reports are going to pull from, the data there is going to be between an hour and a half old because the frequency of the jobs that get them in there run between every 5 minutes and every run at 1 hour. So it's almost live data, just about an hour behind. And then there's cubes, which the reports we'll be talking about for the rest of the presentation today. Those cubes refresh every 24 hours. So the data in those will be up to 24 hours old, which means that they're ideal for things like trending reports or monthly status reports. If you needed to see a list of all of the incidents created in the last few hours, you probably wouldn't use the cubes as your data source for that. You would use the Datamart or a view in Service Manager to get that information. So the data in the cubes is going to refresh once a day.
Hey, Nick, real quickly, just to confirm, reporting against the CMDB is not supported. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah, it is possible to do, and we've had some customers do that in the past. They've built reports against the CMDB. The issue that you'll run into with doing that, there's 2 primary issues. The reason why it's not supported is that Microsoft won't guarantee that those tables and views in the database won't change. They do guarantee that in the data warehouse. So if you write a report, you can be confident that that report will always work, even as the software goes through patches. For the CMDB, that's not always going to be the case. That database is also optimized for read-write transactions, where the data warehouse is optimized for primarily read transactions, so you get more performance in the data warehouse. But it is possible to do. Oh, and the second issue that you'll run into is there's a lot of GUIDs and a lot of internal names used in the CMDB. One of the jobs of the ETL jobs is to take all of the GUIDs and internal references out and replace it with friendly text. So it's going to be a lot easier to read the data coming out of a report that's pointed at the data warehouse as opposed to one pointed at the live CMDB. So what we're going to do now is just look at those cubes specifically. And we find a lot of folks aren't all that familiar with what a cube is or what it allows us to do or why we want to use it. So we just wanted to cover that real briefly. And then we're going to get into how we actually build a report off of these. So an OLAP cube is a data source just like the DW Datamart database. It's going to carry a duplicate of data. So it's data duplicated from the DW Datamart. It's its own separate data source. But the advantage here is that we can access that data where these cubes can be read and understood by Excel 2010 or SharePoint 2010 Performance Point. So it's going to mean that we can use these tools that we're much more familiar with, like Excel, in order to access this data. And Excel has a feature built in Excel 2010 does, where it can read these cubes and present it to us in a pivot table format. There's 6 cubes that are available to us out of the box that carry different kinds of information, and we have them listed here. The one you'll probably work with most commonly is the work items cube. This will carry data about incidents, problems, changes, service requests, release records, and activities. And it also carries a lot of data about those work items, like who they're assigned to, who the affected user is, what computers they're affecting, and things like that. That's the most common cube that we use. There's also a change in activity cube, which is just a subset of the work items cube, really focused at building just, change reports, CAB meeting reports, those sorts of things. But since it's a smaller cube and it's scoped down a little bit, those reports will run a little bit more quickly. It's going to be more performant because it has less data to sort of filter through. The config items cube then is just like the work items cube, except it's going to point at all of the configuration items in the system, like computers and software, network devices, databases, all of those sorts of things. And again, data about those, like who the primary user of a computer is, what computer a piece of software is installed on, those sorts of things. The service catalog cube is really our only way of reporting on the service catalog, and that allows us to get a list of service offerings and request offerings that have been built in your self-service portal. So that's a real helpful way, especially as your portal starts to expand and grow over time, of managing that portal and making sure that you've got a clear idea of the kinds of things that are out there. Because if you have any experience with configuring the self-service portal in the console, it's difficult to get that kind of single pane of glass picture of everything that's in your service catalog. So these cubes are going to make it easier to do that. And the next two, the Power Management Cube and the Software Update Cube, these are really related to the other System Center products in the suite. When you enable connectors into VMM or into Configuration Manager, it's going to populate data that will allow you to report on features of those other products. These are 2 examples that Microsoft has included. And as we'll discuss later, you can also build your own cubes that will allow you to report on data from other tools, such as Operations Manager, which has a connector to Service Manager as well. So in terms of how we actually use these cubes, we can see them right in the console in the Data Warehouse workspace. We can get a list of the 6 that are out of the box here in this environment. And all we do to start running an Excel report on this cube, Microsoft's provided us with a task, you can see over on the right-hand side, I'll point at it here, to analyze the cube in Excel. So right from the console, if you have Excel installed on your computer, you can click on that task, and it's going to launch a Excel session. It'll give you your pivot table, and it's going to plug right into that cube that you have highlighted when you click that task. So now I'm going to turn it over to Pete, and Pete's going to explain and go through some explanation about how we would build these reports in Excel and what kind of features and capabilities we get there.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, as you can see, it really is just a pivot table at this point. And we're not going to go into too much detail about pivot tables. Many of you probably already know how to build pivot tables or pivot charts. And not to take anything away, they're very, very powerful and they're very, very effective. In terms of where the data is in these OLAP cubes, you can see that we've got on the left-hand side here, we've got some measures. You can see the kinds of things that are calculated for us right in the cube, like average incidents linked per problem, average incidents per configuration item, the incident dim count, which is basically just a count of incidents based on criteria that you apply. And this is not a complete list, by the way. This is just what I could get into one screen clip. And I just wanted to call attention to that these measures are built in. And we'll probably touch in a couple of minutes on the idea that you could add to these if you wanted to. Oh, go on, Nick.
Oh, I was just going to say, and I think the real advantage of that, a lot of these are simple, like counts. But what it does is the cube's going to do the math for you. So if you're writing SQL-based reports, you're going to have to do all of the math yourself using functions and in Visual Studio when you're building the report. Here the math is built in, so you're really just dragging these into a column, and it's going to calculate things for you. So it takes kind of the figuring out of these metrics out of it for you since it's built right in.
Yeah, and then just moving across, the middle graphic just shows us the properties that we have. So we're in what's called the incident dimension. And, for those of you who are familiar with Service Manager, you'll recognize most of these. You'll recognize, the close date, the created date, the display name, first assigned date, etc. And again, this is what I could fit into a screen clip. So we've got many more properties here. And then I also wanted to call attention to, in the right graphic, the idea that our enumerations, our lists, are actually going to be their own individual properties. And I'll show you an example of that. Nick, if you could advance, because I think I've got an example of that in this pivot table. So I built this pivot table from the work item cube. As Nick said, that's the one that will allow us to get to our incident data. And I wanted to try to combine a few things here. This is obviously a very, very simple pivot table. It's a very, very simple report. This took me, I don't know, maybe 10 minutes to put together. So as Nick explained, it really is a lot more efficient, a lot quicker than SQL, particularly if you just need to pull data on the fly. You can see what we're doing up here. We've got the created date as a filter for the overall pivot table. And the next time we advance, I'll show you the way that that's going to work, how that filter works. And then I'm just bringing in, you can see here, incident tier Q, which is really support group. Tier Q is the internal name. The priority. And then I'm using the built-in measures here just to get count, and then I've got incidents breaching at least one SLO. So that's just a measure that I picked up right out of the cube, not something that I had to calculate in the pivot table. And then for those who are familiar, you'll recognize this slicer here. I've just decided that I'm going to further filter this data based on source, so I've picked console and email here. There wasn't any great logic to this report. I'm not saying this is necessarily a report that you would find great value in. It's really just to illustrate the kind of things that we can do with the cube. And as I said, in 10 minutes, I had this together, and I really didn't need to do anything other than just go into the data warehouse workspace in the console and analyze this in Excel. And Nick, if I could ask you to advance. I wanted to show you how we're filtering on this date here. This is important to call attention to because this is not something you're going to find out of the box. This is actually a customization to the work item cube. Nick, can you just touch very, very briefly on it because I know we don't have a lot of time left.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, the date properties that are in Service Manager by default are not read as dates by Excel. They're just read as text. So there's a fix that Microsoft provided, and we'll put the link in the description of our YouTube video of this post, so you'll be able to see that. That explains how to create a new table that will basically hold the same information, like in this case it's the created date, but it'll hold it in a date format so Excel can read it. And as you can see, that allows us to filter by year, by quarter, by fiscal year, by month. Obviously, when it's a text property, Excel doesn't understand that these are dates, and you don't get that kind of filtering capability. So this is something that we had done as a customization, but Microsoft had published that the data or the instructions on how to do that with the created date.
Great, thanks, Nick. And then you can advance to the next. So in terms of getting value from Service Manager data, just a couple of kind of conceptual points here that we try to make with customers. The first is we always advise looking at your data from two perspectives, what we think of as the working data and the reporting data, because they may be the same, but in some cases they may be different. Working data meaning what data are we going to need when we're actually trying to do whatever we're trying to do, resolve an incident, complete a change request, solve a problem. The data that we need to do that may not be the same as the data that we need for reporting. The data that we need when we're going to look back at our incidents, look back at our changes, look back at our problems. So we always advise trying to come at the data from those two perspectives. And very importantly, plan on your reporting before you design your configuration. Oftentimes the reporting is kind of done after the fact. There's a lot of energy around getting the configuration together, and then at the very end, once the configuration is done, then we start to talk about reporting. And we really like to kind of front load those discussions, talk about the audiences, who's going to consume this data, at what intervals, what actions are they going to take, what actions do we want them to be able to take, and therefore what data do they need to do that, and what stories do you want these reports to tell. I think that's an important perspective to take, because oftentimes the data can tell a story. Sometimes it needs some narrative accompaniment to do that. But you can do a lot with the data if you've got the right data at the right time in front of the right people. So like I say, we always advise trying to front load reporting conversations so that drives your configuration and not the other way around.
And just to punctuate that, it can impact the configuration of the system. That's another reason why we like to hit that early, because if there's certain types of data that you're going to want to have access to in the reports, it can impact the kinds of list values that you're going to choose and things like that. So it does have a design impact.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and speaking of list values, this is an area where, and for those who are familiar with the application, you know exactly what we're talking about. The list values really will drive a lot of that reporting data. I think list values oftentimes provide less value in terms of working data and more value in terms of reporting. One of the things a lot of people notice about Service Manager is that it doesn't have cascading lists, which is good and bad. I think there are some technical advantages to that, but a lot of people like cascading lists because it forces you to pick items at the lowest level of the hierarchy. We can't do that in Service Manager because we have just plain hierarchical lists. So the thing we always advise is make sure that all the list values in your lists, or at least as many as possible, are reportable. In other words, don't build hierarchies in just for navigation purposes, because you may end up having people picking list values that you really don't want or need for reporting purposes. The other thing that we recommend is to really look carefully if you've got access to this data at past transaction volume, or at least think about your predicted transaction volume. And what I mean by that is very simply, don't come up with a lot of different list values for things that you very rarely classify. Like if you had 3 of a certain kind of incident last year, it probably doesn't deserve its own classification category. And that kind of goes along with the last point there about avoiding unnecessary granularity. Our rule of thumb, and it really is just our rule of thumb based on our practice, is to, when in doubt, leave it out. It's easier generally to add things in than it is to take them out after you discover 3-6 months down the line that you don't need something. Moving down, consider the date and duration reporting requirements. This really just means, are you going to need to determine for something like status or for some other list property, you're going to need to know when that particular value was chosen, was selected, and then maybe when another one was selected in its place. Are those intervals going to be important to you for reporting purposes? You will get some of that with the built-in list values in the data warehouse. You'll have to consider whether you'll need those for any custom properties that you add. Nick talked about what you can do with views, which we think is kind of cool, the idea that you can actually copy and paste data out of views. They actually are pretty good for snapshots and for just quick ad hoc reporting. So keep that in mind and don't think that you need to build a report, whether it's an SSRS report or a cube report, for anything, because you may not need to. You may be able to just use views. This is a big one. Understanding what is and isn't available in the data warehouse and in the cubes. Don't just assume everything is in the data warehouse. Most of our customers at some point, we work with most of our customers at some point to orient them on the data warehouse and the cubes and to make sure that they know what's there and how they're going to be able to get to it. Very, very important, and particularly for any customizations, because the customizations don't always just land automatically in the data warehouse. There are cases in which if you've extended the CMDB, you'll need to do a little bit of work in the data warehouse to enable the data warehouse for reporting on those custom properties. And we talked about the last point, which is just to begin with the end in mind and to plan your reporting sooner rather than later, because I always say that to customers, you spend so much time thinking about how you're going to get data into this system. Try to spend a proportionate amount of time trying to figure out how you're going to get data out of the system. Nick, do you have a comment? Do you want to add something?
Yeah, I was just going to, and I'll go to the next slide for this. We've got some links. We're going to also put these in the description of the YouTube video when this gets posted, so you can find them there. On one of the points you had mentioned prior, understand what data is available in the data warehouse and what isn't. One of the things I wanted to say there, though, is that the data warehouse is extensible. The way you would use management packs to extend the service manager database, you can use management packs to extend the data warehouse as well. So just because a piece of data isn't in the data warehouse by default doesn't mean it can't be there. And oftentimes, you can get the data there. Really, just about any piece of data you're plugging into Service Manager, you'll be able to have move through to the data warehouse. You just want to make sure that that's been set up properly, and that really becomes an issue mostly when you're talking about customization. For extending the Service Manager CMDB, we just want to be careful that the right kind of data is landing in the data warehouse. So we do have 2 links here. We only have 2 because that second link there is Travis Wright for Microsoft had put this together, and it's a wiki page for the data warehouse and reporting, and it covers just about everything. It covers how to extend the data warehouse, for instance, all of the different parts of the data warehouse, what kind of data moves through. There's data warehouse schemas in that section, so that's a really good resource. We use that often. The first link up at the top there is a demo that Chris Lauren had done last year on it was a deep dive on creating custom reports using the OLAP cubes. We, in this session, we're really aiming just to provide an overview of the new OLAP cube functionality. If you're looking for a demonstration on how to build those reports, that video covers it, and Chris Lauren does a really good job in that video explaining the different kinds of things that you can do. We're also going to do a deeper data warehouse session where we get into building reports and also dashboards in SharePoint Dashboard Designer, which is another capability of the cubes. But for now, that video is really helpful, so I recommend you check that out if you're interested in learning more about building these cubes yourself.
Yeah, I have a quick question, Nick. This is Dave. I saw the schema poster floating around. Can you comment on that? Have you seen that? Is that on this wiki?
Yeah, the schema for the new 2012 data warehouse is out there, and it's linked to from that wiki, so you can download that.
Great, good. So if you got questions, please put them in IM. We've just got a few minutes for questions. If we don't get to your question, please feel free to follow up with us. Send an email to this info @ and we'll make sure we follow up with those. The presentation itself will be recorded and pushed to our YouTube site, so you can have a look at it there as well. And pass along if you've got others who may be interested. So if you have questions, go ahead and type, and we'll submit them to Pete and Nick.
Yeah, so the question is Microsoft's recommendation for RAM on the data warehouse management server is at least 16 gigabytes if that server also hosts SQL and analysis services. But they've heard that some users have needed at least 32 gigabytes for reporting to work properly, and what's our recommendation? We have seen that also. Yeah, SQL Server Analysis Services is a heavy memory consumer. It only consumes the memory once a day when those cubes process, but it needs quite a lot of memory in order to do that. What you'll often see in SQL environments is if you've got SQL Server database engine on a server, it's going to slowly over time consume all of the memory on that server, and you'll see that it's going to leave very little memory over for other operations, and that includes processing OLAP cubes. So the first recommendation I would make is to separate analysis services from the database. We put them on separate servers, and oftentimes we'll put analysis services right on the data warehouse management server, and we'll leave the database on a second, separate server. So that's one thing you can do to help ensure that those cubes process every night, is to keep those components separate. But yeah, I mean, typically for us, 16 gigabytes has been sufficient, especially if we do it that way. If you have all of your components on a single server, we've had in the past to increase above 16 gigabytes. We've gone to 32 gigabytes in some cases when we've had all of those components on the same server. So the best thing to do to get around that's really to keep them separate, and then you can keep your amount of memory down overall.
Sounds like it's a wrap. If there are further questions, please go ahead and submit them. You can see them to that address that we have here. I just want to say thanks to Pete and Nick. We look forward to seeing